Welcome to today's webinar, the USMCA and other free trade agreements. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dave Noah, and I am founder and president of Shipping Solutions. Since 1995, our export documentation and compliance software has helped thousands of successful exporters more efficiently generate accurate export documents and stay compliant with import-export regulations. To help educate our customers and the wider international trade community, we regularly host free webinars like this one on the various aspects of international trade. Today's webinar is a rebroadcast of a live presentation we hosted in April 2023 that featured Robert Imbriani, who talked about the US-Mexico-Canada agreement and the other free trade agreements the United States has entered into with other countries. We are very lucky to have Bob's insight into these agreements. Bob has been in the transportation and logistics field for more than 5 decades. He's held various senior executive positions with major U.S. customs brokers and freight forwarders. He is currently Executive Vice President International for Team Worldwide and President of Team Ocean Services, Inc., Team International Trade Services, and Team Canada. Bob is a well-known speaker and educator in the area of compliance, contract negotiations, transportation, logistics and supply chain solutions, customs brokerage, trade development, and financial services. He is an adjunct professor in these areas at Baruch College and Pace University in New York. He has conducted classes at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy and the U.S. Naval Academy. Because we are rebroadcasting a previously live presentation, we won't be taking any questions from the audience at the end of today's webinar. Instead, we will be listening to the questions that were submitted during the live broadcast. With that in mind, I'm happy we can present this webinar again. So Bob, please go ahead and thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and welcome everyone to today's program. A little sort of preamble or statement before we get started. The U.S. has a number of trade agreements and specific ones that we refer to as free trade agreements. In order to provide a good understanding of our trade agreements, we will focus on the USMCA, the US-Mexican-Canadian Free Trade Agreement, as an example, and it will provide the basis of understanding for our other trade agreements as well. We find it's much better to focus on a single agreement and reference some of the others as we go through the process of being compliant. Many companies who export and import have import or export compliance programs, and those are very necessary. However, an area of neglect by many companies, especially exporters, is to have a compliance program related to the U.S. free trade agreements. And you'll see as we go through the process that there can be significant responsibility on the exporter, the seller, to document how they determine if the goods they are selling qualify for the benefits of that trade agreement. So having said that, let's get started. We'll give you some background on our trade agreements, and we'll even break out of the PowerPoint presentation at a few portions of this program to show you some other documents or reference material. You know, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide an understanding of not only the USMCA, which replaced NAFTA, but also our other free trade agreements. USMCA, or the old NAFTA, is probably the most pervasive and active of all of our free trade agreements. Provide an understanding of how to take advantage of these agreements. These can be very valuable to exporters to make your product equally or more competitive in the participating markets, and can also be valuable to importers as well. Most importantly, to understand the basics of qualifying goods under a free trade agreement and what the responsibilities of the different parties involved are, the manufacturer, the exporter, the importer. Also, we'll start out with some information, why participate, and misconceptions about U.S. free trade agreements. So hopefully we'll get all of that into our program today. Now, our free trade agreements are there to promote fair competition between the participating countries. Many times there are barriers to trade between countries, and the US over the years has been very good to come up with tariff preference programs and other programs that were sort of one-sided. We would give developing nations and others preferential treatment with their goods coming to the US, but they were not obligated to give our goods preferential treatment in their country. So our free trade agreements are designed to balance the table, if you will, for both countries to have similar benefits and programs when they trade together. Eliminate the barriers to trade, increase investment opportunity, and today a very important area, provide protection for intellectual property, protect labor and the environment, provide a mechanism for dispute resolution, and from a U.S. perspective, protect U.S. industry from unfair trade competition. Now, we won't address every one of these issues or objectives. Some of them have to do with opening businesses and banking and other areas. We will look primarily at those areas that affect trade, the buying and selling of commodities between the participating countries. Now, what are some of the misconceptions about our free trade agreements? I'm going to start off by saying we actually don't have any free trade agreements. That we call them free trade agreements, but it's probably, in my mind, a misnomer. Our agreements are really preferential trade agreements, in that only those goods that meet very specific or strict rules of origin will be eligible for the benefits of the trade agreement. That's unlike a trade agreement like the European Union, which is truly a free trade agreement. Anything that's manufactured in a country of the European Union moves freely to the other member nations. If something is imported into one member nation of the EU, it moves freely to the other member nations with no customs clearance or duties assessed. There may be VAT, value-added tax or other taxes, but no duties or entry process. So the first thing is to understand that only goods that qualify under these strict rules of origin are benefiting from the trade agreement. So they really should be called preferential trade agreements. They provide completely free trade for all products and services. That's not always true either. Many of our trade agreements have a phase-in period, that the full benefit of the agreement, the reduction or elimination of duty, is phased in over a period of time. Under our trade agreements, although rare, there can be countervailing or anti-dumping duties on certain commodities. Participation is mandatory. It is not mandatory. We've had situations where a U.S. exporter may be exporting to Canada or Mexico, and they say you must provide a USMCA certificate of origin. Well, that's not true. First of all, if the goods do not qualify, you cannot provide a certificate of origin or certification that they qualify. You could enter hundreds of shipments a day into US, Canada, or Mexico without a certificate of origin, in that you would just pay the normal rate of duty and not receive the benefits of the free trade agreement. So in effect, you cannot participate if your goods do not qualify, or you cannot document that they qualify. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't participate. Participation has its benefits. Again, all items are immediately duty-free. There are phase-in periods. The exporter receives financial benefits. The exporter doesn't really receive the benefits. The benefits go to the importer of record. That the benefits are primarily revolving around a reduced or elimination of a duty rate, possible reduction in processing fees, or even adjustments in VAT or other taxes. You can have the benefit without the work. There is a certain amount of work to document and certify the goods as being eligible for a trade agreement. And this work should be proactive. Before you begin selling in a market, before you begin selling new product, you should know whether your product qualifies or not, because it will affect how you present it and market it in the country. The importer has the only responsibility for compliance. The importer has a relatively simple responsibility for compliance, that they need to have certification from the seller that the goods qualify, have no reason to believe that information is inaccurate, and that it applies to the shipment that they're entering. The real responsibility is on the seller and or the manufacturer to be able to document and certify the goods as being eligible for the trade agreement. Now, we'll see under the USMCA, they say that the manufacturer or the producer, as it's called, the exporter or the importer can certify the goods, but there are rare cases where an importer has the needed information to be able to certify the goods. So the responsibility is primarily with the seller or the manufacturer, or a combination of both. What are the benefits to the exporter? Well, while the direct benefit is to the importer in the lower duties or fees that might apply, it's to make the exporter's product more or equally attractive to the competition. If your competitor is in a country that does not have a trade agreement with your target country, then their goods cannot qualify for the benefits. Yours do, gives you an advantage in a landed cost price. If you're competing, and you also, in many cases, have a shorter supply chain, lower costs of transportation. Now, if you're competing with somebody in the US and your goods qualify and their goods qualify, at least you're on the same footing with them. However, if your goods qualify and theirs do not, you have an advantage. And to obtain these benefits, the exporter should be proactive. You should be looking at your goods, as I said, before you market them, so that you can, with confidence, say, yes, our goods qualify and we will provide you certification to that effect. Or even in cases where you find your goods do not qualify, you can say, well, our goods do not qualify, but we will give you a discount of X, which is slightly more than the duty would be. Or our product, although it does not qualify, has these quality or other advantages. Knowing whether your goods qualify or not is important to how you market it in that country. If we were to look at the US as an example to determine the benefits, when we enter goods in the US, remembering that the country of origin of the goods always takes preference over the country of export. So when we determine the harmonized number, and we then look at the country of origin of the goods, looking at the US harmonized tariff, if the goods have a country of origin of what we call a most favored nation, one that is a preferred trading partner, but they do not have a trade agreement, or the goods do not qualify for the trade agreement, we would look at the tariff rate in column 1, the general rate, and I'll just use the bottom example, that it would be 2.6%. If the goods had a country of origin of a non-most favored nation, generally a country we could deal with but not a preferred trading partner, we look in the column 2 rate of duty, and in this case it's 40%, significantly higher to discourage trade with those countries. There's a limited number of countries that fall into the column 2 rate of duty. Today, goods from Russia fall into the column 2 rate. However, if we have a shipment and the goods are with a country of origin of a country with whom we have a trade agreement and they qualify for the trade agreement, we look in the column 1 special column, and we find that for these various trade agreements, they're free of duty. they would be USMCA would be CA for Canada or MX for Mexico, or the Singapore trade agreement, or the Israeli freight agreement, or the Australian freight agreement, or even a tariff preference program, the general system of preferences. Now, in different cases, that duty advantage could be far greater than the 2.6%. Just as an example, at the time this page was in effect, for this product here, the normal rate of duty was 2 cents each plus 7%, a compound rate of duty. But under the Singapore trade agreement, it was not yet free, but it was half the normal duty rate. So this is an example how under some trade agreements, the duty benefit is phased in over a period of time. Now, if we were looking at the tariff in another country, Canada, Mexico, or one of the other countries with whom we have an agreement, they would have a similar system, at least for the general and special column. Just to give you an example of what the benefit may be from a duty standpoint. Now, we have a variety of types of trade agreements: regional trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, trade and investment framework agreements, special U.S. duty preference programs. Sort of a mouthful. Many of these have been phased out or are no longer active in favor of more free trade agreements, as we designate them. The most pervasive, as I mentioned, was NAFTA, which is now the USMCA, involves the US, Canada, Mexico. Then we have CAFTA-DR, which is the Central American countries and the Dominican Republic. One of our oldest, if not the oldest, trade agreement is the US-Israeli Free Trade Agreement. We have an agreement with Australia, with Chile, with Singapore, with South Korea, Colombia, Panama. These codes in red are the codes you would look for in the special column of the US harmonized tariff to determine if the goods are eligible for that agreement, what the rate of duty or benefit would be. We have some lesser known agreements: US, Jordan, Morocco, Bahrain, Peru, and Oman. So you could see we have quite a few free trade agreements. While most people are familiar with the USMCA, or many people still refer to it as NAFTA, it's many other agreements exist, and they should be part of your global strategy, primarily for exporters to look at targeting these markets where your product will have an advantage, but also for sourcing. If you source from these markets, it will lower your landed cost if you purchase from these countries and the goods qualify. What other agreements are out there? A while back, we were looking at what was called TPP, the US Asia Pacific Agreement. We decided not to go forward with it, and at this point it's dead, but it's still out there and could come back under a future administration. The European Union's possible, but not likely in the near future. However, US UK have been in discussions. Since the UK has left the EU, they are looking to expand markets, and certainly not within the next year or two, but possibly in the foreseeable future, a US UK free trade agreement. And there are other possibilities that maybe we're not even aware of at this time. So understanding how to participate and be compliant within the free trade agreement format is very important for companies as they expand their global trade. Again, we tend to focus on it from an export perspective, but it's also a sourcing benefit as well. And if you look at sourcing in China, you not only have a long supply chain, and a supply chain that recently has had its ups and downs and has been a very expensive supply chain, and additional rates of duty over and above the normal rate of duty, where if you participate with countries that are partners in our free trade agreement programs, you will get a reduced or completely free rate of duty. So completely the opposite of what you might see in trading with a country like China. We have some other tariff preference programs that have been out there. Most have been phased out in favor of the free trade programs, because these programs were, as I mentioned, one-sided. They provided benefits to those developing countries, but not really for US products going into those countries. So, what is the new agreement? We'll give you some comparisons to NAFTA, and then we'll get into the real nuts and bolts of qualifying. You know, it's called something different. It's kind of interesting. NAFTA was pretty straightforward. In Canada, they call it the Canadian-US-Mexican Agreement. In Mexico, it's called the Treaty between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and we call it the US-Mexican-Canadian Agreement. I think each country wanted to get their name first, so there's almost no official name for it. It's referred to differently in each country. You can look at it as an update or a replacement to NAFTA, correcting some of the flaws or problems that existed even within NAFTA. It includes updates to areas such as automotive, intellectual property, agricultural, digital trade, and environmental issues. It was signed by all three countries November 30th, 2018, and each country had to ratify it. So it actually went into effect July 1st, 2020. So even though it's been 3 years, we did have a period of time because of the pandemic where implementing it, learning about it was possibly a little slow to take place because of the difficulties caused by the pandemic. Some of the key changes that are involved, and our agreements also try to promote fairness and environmental issues. And one of the provisions is that by this year, automotive companies in Mexico must have an average minimum wage of $16 an hour, and the amount of regional value content in components made in Mexico for the automotive industry have to have a higher percentage of regional value content than before to again promote labor issues and other benefits to the Mexican worker and the Mexican economy. Farmers get more access to Canadian dairy markets, which were restricted. And the US got Canada to open up its dairy market to US farmers and so forth. Intellectual property, a big issue, a global issue, protecting copyrights, trademarks, and things of that issue, but also how digital trade is conducted. There are many industries today that their mode of delivery of their products is electronic. Ebooks and computer programs and music and movies and other things now are electronic, and even e-commerce to some extent are issues that were never addressed in NAFTA or even our other trade agreements, because many of them were before these areas became a major part of global trade. There's a sunset clause, and I'll kind of explain how that works. NAFTA was a treaty that went on forever. The USMCA is designed that it has to be reviewed every 6 years. And they have to look at it and say what has changed, what needs to be improved. And then there's a period of time after they agree on changes to implement those changes. So unlike our other trade agreements or even NAFTA, there's a specific process for keeping the agreement current, for addressing new ways business are conducted between the countries, and making sure we address issues that maybe didn't even exist when the agreement went into place. There are some other elements. It raises the de minimis rule, which we'll talk about. It eliminates some of the unique ways to determine the country of origin that existed under NAFTA. It protects digital trade. It actually eliminated the need for a certificate of origin, but we will talk about that certificates of origin are still the primary way certification is handled. Rules of origin and the de minimis rule increase from 7 to 10%. We'll talk about that. This is just a breakdown of how the agreement is actually set up. It's a very large agreement. I only show this to give you an idea of how complex they are. And there are elements in it with investing in the countries, opening businesses, taxes, things that are not relevant to the agreement when we're looking at it as a trade agreement between the countries. Each country can stop suspected shipments that violate intellectual property. IT and IP enforcement procedures will be available in the digital environment. So in general, they have increased the e-commerce and the cyber security, but also it prohibits duties on certain products that are going to be electronically traded, such as books, programs, music, movies, things of that nature. It allows for side letters. Side letters are issues where two of the countries have a specific issue that affect those two countries. They can enter into sort of an addendum or what's called a side letter to the USMCA, where they agree just between those two countries that there will be special rules or special procedures for those topics. Whereas some related to cheese, wine, and distilled spirits, or illegal fishing practices and so forth. So it allows over the course of the agreement to have these side letters or special agreements between two of the countries where maybe the third country doesn't have an issue with it. Where under our other trade agreements in NAFTA, it was all the countries or none. Verification of origin. This has not changed. The importing country has the right to audit, visit, review, and even assess penalties on the party who certified the goods as being eligible, which in many cases is the producer or the exporter. You have to remember, if you export something to another country under a trade agreement, there's no loss to US Customs or the US Treasury. It's to the importing country. So our agreements, all of our agreements, allow the importing country to audit, visit, penalize any party who certified the goods, which in most cases is the exporter or the producer. Now, they'll do it many times within cooperation with US Customs, but they have the right to do it. And it can involve civil and criminal penalties if they feel that it was knowingly falsified that the goods qualify. To some extent, certifying goods under a trade agreement is a little bit like taking a tax deduction. If it's a legal deduction, that's great. Take an illegal deduction, and the IRS has lots of tools at their disposal to penalize that party. Well, saying goods qualify for a trade agreement, and if they do, that's fine. But if not, you have defrauded the importing government, and they have tools at their disposal. So it is important to have a compliance program and to document how you've determined the goods qualify. They will normally send a written request to the party who certified the goods. Sometimes that will start with the importer. But many times the importer is going to say, I certified it because my supplier certified it to me. Then they will go to the supplier and see if they can prove how they certified it. They can also do, as we said, site visits and audits. Now, certification requirements. NAFTA and the Israeli Free Trade Agreement were actually the only two agreements that the US had where there was a specific format for a certificate of origin under those agreements. All of our other agreements allowed certification to be a certificate of origin, and there were no formal structure for the certificate of origin, or a statement, letter, or information on the commercial invoice that the goods qualify. The Israeli Free Trade Agreement did away with the certificate of origin probably now about 5 years ago. An Israeli certificate of origin is no longer required. In fact, that's one agreement where they prefer not to even have the certificate of origin. Under the other trade agreements, including USMCA, you can provide a certificate of origin or a letter or statement on the commercial invoice that the goods qualify. All three forms are acceptable. Most parties will still use a certificate of origin because it is the most structured and best way to validate what you're saying and what you're providing information on. The certificates of origin will generally look like a NAFTA certificate of origin with variations for the different trade agreements. However, there are no formal format for the certificate of origin under any of our trade agreements at the present time. The only certificate of origin that you'll see will look somewhat different is the US South Korean trade agreement. The South Korean customs prefers a certificate of origin that is somewhat structured differently than the other certificates of origin and also has some of the information in Korean. The certification under USMCA is actually designed that it can be provided by the producer, which is the manufacturer, the exporter, or the importer. But in a little bit, when we start looking at the details you need to certify the goods, you will quickly see that the importer, unless they own the manufacturer or are doing contract manufacturing, wouldn't have all of the information necessary to be able to certify the goods. So it is going to fall back on the exporter or the producer. There are some de minimis amounts that are allowed where a certificate is not required, but you must still qualify the goods. You just don't need the certificate of origin or the certification form. Again, each party shall provide the certification upon request to the importer and make it available to customs in that country. Shipments that have a value not to exceed $1,000 US do not require formal certification, but they must still qualify. That's a little bit of a misunderstanding with our agreements, that if you could say that shipments under $1,000 don't have to qualify and you still get the same benefit, you would just ship a bunch of small shipments and not have to pay the duties. So it doesn't work quite like that. Again, a formal certificate of origin is not required, and we'll get to certificates and that in a little bit. So now we're going to cross into more detailed information, and we want to provide some wording that you'll find in our trade agreements. When they say good, it's the item that you're determining, is it eligible for the trade agreement benefits or not? Material is that from which the item is made. The party are the participating countries. The territory is the total geographical area, possessions, and so forth of the participating countries. The term originating means that the good is eligible for the benefits of that trade agreement. Non-originating means that the goods are not eligible for the benefit of that trade agreement. Now, non-originating materials, if they go through a transformation that is acceptable under the rules of origin for that agreement, then they can become originating. But we also want to bring up that an originating good, if it goes through processing of any kind outside the territories of the participating countries, it will no longer qualify. So we focus mostly on materials and that transform and become originating goods. But remember, an originating product, if it is processed outside of the territory of the participating countries, could wind up no longer being eligible. Indirect material are materials used in the manufacture of the goods: fuel, energy, tools, dyes, molds, and their country of origin does not matter. If they are used in the manufacture of the goods, their cost or value can be part of what we call regional value content. Intermediate material is a material made within a company that, let's say you make some type of lighting, and you make a switch internally and it's used in 10 of your different products. That would be an intermediate material that you produce. You determine the eligibility of that item so that when it's used at the next level, you know whether it qualifies or not. Now, there's a term, wholly grown or produced within a participating country. That means that it is either mined or manufactured within that country. Mere dilution, repackaging, simple assembly does not change the country of origin and would not, in general, meet the strict rules of origin under our trade agreements. So there are, under our trade agreements, what we call preference criteria. And part of what you need to do when you certify the goods as being eligible is to indicate under what preference criteria they qualify. Criteria A talks about the goods being wholly produced or obtained in a participating country. Now, obtained does not mean purchased. This generally applies to goods that are harvested, mined, farmed, fished, raw materials, and other types of products that are naturally grown, harvested, fished, so forth within a participating country. It is rare that any manufactured item would fall under criteria A. And it's a criteria that many people misunderstand because it says wholly produced or obtained. Well, I bought this in the US, so it must qualify. That's not the definition of obtained. They're looking again at raw materials, grown, harvested, things of that nature. You may be in an industry where this applies, flower industry or any type of the food product industries and so forth could very well, chemical industries and coal and many other things, but not as prevalent as people might think that the wording indicates. Our next criteria is criteria B. It is the most common criteria to qualify under our trade agreements. Criteria B in effect says that one or more of the materials that goes into the finished product are not qualifying or not originating before they go in. But the transformation from a material or a component into the final product is acceptable, making the final product qualify. So if we were to have a product, this is this light gray item is the finished product. We have 3 items on our level 1 bill of material. One is made in Taiwan, one is made in Germany, and one is US origin. Based on this, 2 of these are not originating. We need to get the harmonized number to the first 6 digits of the finished good, the harmonized number to the first 6 digits of each of the non-originating, then refer to the rules of origin for that product and see if the transformation from this harmonized number to this harmonized number by itself is acceptable, or if we need some additional calculations, such as what's referred to as regional value content. Now, under the de minimis rule, this is already originating. We'll say that this goes through an acceptable transformation, but this does not go through an acceptable transformation, but by net cost, it's 10% or less of the cost to manufacture this item. It could still qualify because this would fall under the de minimis rule. An example of the rules of origin would be, and this was under NAFTA, that a change to heading 902710 through 902750 from any other heading, or a change to subheadings 902710 through 902750 from subheading 902790, whether or not there's a change from any other, plus regional value content. You would see if what we learned from our bill of materials, if you qualified under A or B. Now, I wanted to show NAFTA so that we could show the USMCA has simplified some of the rules. Here it says a change to subheading 902710 through 902750 from any other subheading, including another subheading within that group. If you meet that, you will qualify. There's no exception for one of the subheadings, no regional value content or anything required. You will find that the USMCA has allowed more items to be eligible for the benefits than NAFTA did. NAFTA was a little stricter in what was required. If you qualified under NAFTA, you will qualify under the USMCA. If you didn't qualify under NAFTA, there's some possibility that under the USMCA you will qualify. Then we go to criteria C, where all of the goods before they go into the product are originating. But it does not matter how they became originating. They could be an A, a B, a C, a D, whatever, but they all have to be originating before they go in. And you're still allowed that 10% de minimis rule. Items such as spare parts, accessories, minor things that might be sent with it. You know, sometimes when you buy a toy or a piece of furniture, you get a little wrench or Allen key or something that you use. It's not really substantial. Those do not have to qualify. Again, under NAFTA, your de minimis rule was 7%. That has been increased to 10%. And under NAFTA, we had some additional criteria, D, E, and F. They will still exist, but have limited application under the USMCA. Unlike NAFTA, the rules of origin are pretty straightforward. Based on where it became what it is, that will be the country of origin. Now, remember though, under a trade agreement, the country of origin can only be a participating country. So if we're certifying something under the USMCA, we can only show the country of origin as US, Canada, or Mexico. If we were tempted to show any other country, then it would not qualify for the USMCA. If it was the US Singapore agreement, it could only be a country of origin of US or Singapore. Each party shall provide that an importer claiming preferential travel treatment for an imported good into their territory shall maintain a period for no less than 5 years from the date of importation. One of the record keeping requirements is that any documentation that you have on the import of these goods or the certification of these goods must be kept for 5 years, 60 months from the latest date of import that they support. When we talk about the certificates of origin in a little bit, you can issue it on a shipment by shipment basis or for a blanket period up to 1 year. If you were to issue a certificate for a blanket period of up to 1 year, you must keep the supporting documents for 5 years from the expiration date of the certificate, not the date it was created. All records to verify how you determine the goods qualify need to be kept for that period of time and made available to customs from the importing or exporting country upon request. There's documentation related to if you're using regional value content, having to verify the cost factors that you're using for that. There's provisions for dispute settlement within the trade agreements as well. This is something that was lacking in NAFTA. One of the things that a ruling in any one country for eligibility must be accepted by the other participating countries as to the goods being eligible. So the rules of origin under the MCA are somewhat less restrictive than NAFTA. If you qualified under NAFTA, you will qualify under the USMCA. And in some cases where you may not have qualified under NAFTA, you may qualify under the USMCA. Our other trade agreements are structured very much as we just looked at. Now, we're not finished with the program quite yet. Because of the nature of this program, I want to come out of the slides and show you some information that will be important when qualifying the goods. This is a copy of the U.S. Harmonized Tariff. In order to understand the rules of origin, get specific information on our trade agreements, there are a number of places you can go. But if you go into the U.S. Harmonized Tariff under the General Notes section, and along with General Tariff information, and I'm just scrolling down, you will find the rules of origin for all of our trade agreements. And we talked about the rules of origin, transformation, all of the rules of origin. Each of our trade agreements will be detailed in the general note section of the U.S. Harmonized Tariff. And I find it is the best place to reference the rules and structure of our agreements, because many times you're going to also be working with the proper classification of the material and the finished good. So you're working within the harmonized tariff and the harmonized system. And that was USMCA. This is the Korean agreement. Just wanted to show you a place to find that information. Now, I talked about documentation. If you have a complex product, a product that you manufacture, part of your documentation should contain a worksheet based on the level 1 bill of materials. This is an example of a worksheet. The product we're looking to determine eligibility is this product here. In this case, it's a chemical. This is the harmonized number to the first 6 digits. These are the level 1 bill of materials of what goes into that product. There's some internal information as to the vendor, but then there's the harmonized number to the first 6 digits, the value of the goods net cost to make a specified unit of the product, and a very important area, whether the goods are originating or not before they go in. Then you look up the rule of origin for the finished product, the 2933, which would fall into this rule. And then you apply this rule to the information you have here. In this case, we would be concerned with 3 of the materials. These 2 which are not originating, and then this one that's not originating. If we look at the first 2 and we look at the value per unit, we'll find that it falls below the de minimis amount. So we don't have to worry about those 2. In fact, even if we applied the rule of origin, they would go through an acceptable transformation, changing from 131874 and 380210 to 293369 based on this rule would be acceptable. However, when we look at this one here, it has the same harmonized number as the finished product. The amount is too much for the de minimis rule. It does not meet the rules of origin. So even though this product is manufactured here in the United States and under non-preferential rules of origin, you could label this made in the US. It would not be eligible for the USMCA. Now, that's not very common, but I wanted to use an example where just because something is manufactured in a participating country, there is the possibility that it does not meet the rules of origin and therefore would not be eligible. So you don't want to assume, well, I make it here, it's fine, because you don't want to certify it. Then they come back and say, prove your certification. And when you go through a process like this, you find out it doesn't. I will again say it's rare that this would happen, but it's not impossible. Now, if you're not the manufacturer and you resell somebody else's product, in order for you to issue certification, you should have certification from that vendor that you keep in your file And that's your supporting documents why you certified it to your customer. If you're a manufacturer, your record keeping is going to be more extensive. And one last thing, and then we'll field the questions. There are many formats for certificates of origin under our free trade agreements. This is one of the formats for the USMCA. It's going to show who's certifying it. The rules allow for the importer, exporter, or producer, manufacturer to do so. But in most cases, it's going to be the exporter, which may also be the manufacturer. If the certifying party is not the producer's name goes in here. If you're certifying it and you're not the producer, you can put in here available upon request, not to your customer necessarily, but to customs. Sometimes you may want to hide who the manufacturer actually is. Then we can show the exporter, which could be the same as the certifier, and then the importer. You can issue it for a single transaction or for a blanket period of time up to 12 months. You're going to give it an identifying part number, SKU, something that would identify it against your invoice, a description of the goods that would match your invoice, the harmonized number to the first 6 digits, and then the preference criteria. Then you're going to certify that the goods are eligible. And all of the certificates of origin will have some type of instructions on how to complete the goods, and even a little brief description of the preference criteria. Okay, now I know that this was a little bit of an abbreviated program. To go through a true in-depth training on our free trade agreements would take a minimum of a full day program, but I hope it gave you a good basic understanding of what our programs are, what the benefits are, why you should participate, and the basics of compliance.
This concludes Bob's presentation. At this point, we use the remaining time to answer a few questions from the webinar attendees. Remember, this is a rebroadcast of that original webinar, so we are not able to answer any new questions that you may have. As a distributor or company that who doesn't manufacture parts, we receive the information from the suppliers. Can we, as the distributor, certify the USMCA as certifier and use various on producer, exporter, and importer using the information the supplier provided for the parts and give that to the customer?
Yes, in fact, the first thing, and I did mention this just a moment ago, that your record keeping would be a certificate of origin or other detailed certification from the manufacturer that the goods qualify. Based on the strength of that, having no reason to believe it's inaccurate, you can issue your certification to your customer. Using various in the importer box is acceptable. It allows you to use that same certificate for various importers. Although best business practice is to always show the importer there, and that gives you a record of who you gave the certificate to. In the producer area, the wording would be available upon request as opposed to various. Now, one of the reasons on the importer side you want to show who you gave the certificate to is one of your requirements under the agreement is to advise anyone to whom a certificate was given of any changes in the validity of the information on the certificate. So you can put various on the importer, but normally we suggest you put who you gave the certificates to, so you can use that as a record of who you gave it to and who you might have to notify of a change.
And I'm going to ask one more question, and I apologize. There's just so much information here to try to fit into an hour. We didn't have a lot of time for questions, but the last question we'll ask is, how is something originating before it goes into a finished good if the pre-materials were from several different companies or countries, I think is what that person meant. And they're referring to slide 46 and 47.
Right. Now, a material can be originating or not. If we look at the slide that I had for criteria B, we actually said that one of the materials was originating and the other two were not. So you have to look at the materials individually and look at the source. And let's just say I sourced these two from Germany and Taiwan. I know they're not originating. This one I sourced here in the United States, and the company I sourced it from provided me with a certificate at the material level that this material is originating. One other level where material could become originating is the indirect material, that here I'm making a lens and the resin was from Japan, but I made the lens here in the United States. So I'm going to have my worksheet on myself making this lens as an intermediate material. So either your vendor might certify the material as being originating, or it's an intermediate material that you produced in-house and you can certify that that material is originating.
Okay, and I actually have one more question here that I think is very quick to answer. So I'm going to ask this as our final question. If we are exporting a product from the United States to Mexico, but the product is from Central America, what kind of certificate do we provide?
You actually cannot provide any preferential certificate of origin. That though that good would not qualify for the USMCA. Now, it may qualify for some trade agreement between that third country and Mexico, but you could not certify it as qualifying under USMCA or even that third agreement. So our agreements are specific to the participating countries. So although the US has an agreement with Central America, let's say Costa Rica, that doesn't mean that Mexico has an agreement with Costa Rica. We can only certify for those goods that fall under the rules of origin for the agreement between the US and the country we're selling to.
Our time is up. Thanks for watching, and thank you, Bob, for the great information. If you want more information about the USMCA and other free trade agreements, we have created a webinar resources page on our website at shippingsolutions.com/webinar-resources, which you can also access by scanning the QR code on the screen. This webpage has links to all the resources that we mentioned during today's webinar, as well as links to register for upcoming webinars. You can also subscribe to our free international trade blog, Passages, so you don't miss out on any of the latest export and import news. Finally, please note that you are watching this webinar rebroadcast on our Shipping Solutions YouTube channel. If you are a fan of the import-export information we provide through our webinars and blog posts, please like this video and subscribe, and check out the other short videos we've created on this channel that explain the various aspects of international trade. Your show of support for these free articles, webinars, and videos help us attract knowledgeable speakers like Bob to share their expertise with all of us. Thanks again for joining us today. Stay well, everyone.